Hey everybody, this is going to be one of the two last demos, I suspect, for the year, where I'm going to be covering the basics of modeling in SketchUp, and basically all the tools and what you might use to get sort of basic modeling going. And I will be doing a separate video for how to get specifically 2D outputs from SketchUp and bring them into Photoshop to make a final composition. So for this assignment, what I'd like you guys to do is make a basic massing of one of your design schemes for Studio in SketchUp. So you can see here, most of these are just sort of basic volumes, not much detail to them. They're just kind of approximate size and height. And then go in and add more detail to one of them, and specifically some place where you can do some sort of repetitive structure. So in this case, I happen to have a sort of trellis system here that I built that I'll show you how to build something similar to this. Bring in some third-party models. So these are from the 3D warehouse. They're just little lounge chairs, and I'll show how to make that. And sort of the basic moves. But this is kind of an example file of what your end product might look like. Again, really focusing on maybe one particular component where you think you can do some design study. Not to say that this has been fully fleshed out or anything, it's just an example. But this would be a good sort of place to aim for, or at least a starting point. That building there is probably not super detailed. So the site that I've given you guys, I've already, for this particular model, made some modifications, some push and pulls on it to help it negotiate better with terrain. And that's probably something you'll want to do as well. Again, we have about an 8-foot drop from the highest point of our site to the lowest. So any design that you place on here is going to have to contend with that drop. And this can be a great place to start thinking about that because it's pretty easy to start making those manipulations. Okay, so I'm actually not going to start in this model. I'm going to start in this one. I've laid out a bunch of words here, and these are basically a lot of the functions that I plan to cover. Partly I laid these out for my own purposes to make sure I don't miss anything. So when you load up a SketchUp model, I'm going to load up a new one real quick. I'm currently using SketchUp 2020. There may be a SketchUp 2021 at this point. I'm not entirely sure, but it doesn't matter too much. They don't tend to change too terribly much with each year. It'll ask you for a starting model. I always start with architectural. Just click that, and it'll load up. It will come with a person. It may not be this person, depends on the year. Each year they change out the people. That is the default starting person. From what I've heard, if rumors are true, these are supposedly the staff that makes SketchUp, and they just make them into a different person each year. So the commands on the right are going to be some of the starting things. So you might have noticed that I've been moving the camera around. Camera controls in SketchUp are quite a bit different, and in my opinion, actually quite a bit better than camera controls in Rhino or Revit or most other software I've used. You do have a orbit, which is going to be this item on the left here. Now you may have also noticed I have a keyboard in the lower right-hand corner. It's because most of SketchUp is really controlled through keystrokes. Unlike Rhino, which is command line based, where you type in the name of a command, that doesn't exist in SketchUp. So a lot of using SketchUp properly, is really about learning the keystrokes so that you can become fast and be able to switch between tools really quickly. I will share with you guys my settings file that you can load into your computer and will allow you to use the same keystrokes that I have set up. So one of the essential ones is the look around key, which is this little eye shape. You can see it here. I have it set to Q, and basically it keeps the base of your camera in the same place, but allows you to look around in all directions. That's very useful, especially in combination with what can be accessed through the middle mouse button. In fact, I'll turn the mouse on so we can see him. So the middle mouse button allows you to just automatically go to orbit. So basically between these two things, you can do majority of your movement. The middle mouse button plus Shift allows you to pan. There's also a pan tool that's dedicated to this, but typically I just hold Shift. And you can see here, it's pretty quick and easy to orbit around. So it's good to get used to that early on because some of the strengths of SketchUp are the fact that the camera tools I find to be a bit more intuitive, but also they tend to allow you to work more in perspective at human scale, as opposed to Rhino, which tends to lead to looking more at a model from the sort of 30,000 foot point of view, looking down on it, as opposed to looking inside the model in interior spaces as easily or as directly. So another thing you may notice is I have these toolbars set up and these trays on the right. They may look slightly different for you. If I remember correctly, I think on Mac, the trays don't automatically snap. I could be wrong and it could be just a different version, but at least they didn't used to from my memory. But these trays here are all things that you can load in with different panels that are useful, and I'll cover them a little bit later. But first, if you want to have your toolbars match mine, now I do have a few additional plugins, so everything from here over are additional plugins that I've added in. These aren't necessarily something that you need for this assignment, but they are things that I use on a regular basis. So this is Scatter, Sketch UV, which I didn't cover in my initial demo. It's for precise texture control. Round Corner, Indigo in this case, and Vertex tools. All of which I find very useful, but I'm not really going to cover in this demo because they're additional plugins, some of which cost money, some of which are free. But if you go to Edit, go to, Window. So under Window, under Default Tray, you can adjust the items that you see on the right. These are the ones that I typically leave open: Entity, Material, Components, Style, Tags, Scenes, Shadows, Fog, and Soften Edges. There's a few others in here that are useful, but those are the ones I typically use. And under View, you'll go, there's a toolbar, which should be the first thing that's available. I typically use the Getting Started and the Large tool set. So the Large tool set is the one on the left side, the Getting Started is the one on the top. They cover the vast majority of tools that I use on a regular basis. Granted, every tool that I use, I have mapped to a key, so I never actually have to click on these toolbars very often, except for the tools that I use on a very infrequent basis. So a good example is these text objects that you see here. I almost never use three-dimensional text, so those aren't mapped, but most other things are. If you want to map your own, there are a bunch of defaults. The defaults are actually in the assignment sheet on the second page. However, if you want to change them, if you go to Preferences and open this up and go down to Shortcuts. So basically, you can search for any particular keystroke in here. So one of the ones that I'm probably going to cover later is Component. I can spell. And I'll make this, see if I can make this larger. I can't. So what I'm looking for is a lot of components. I think it's Show Components, this one here. Nope. Hide Rest of Model. So that's going to be a very useful one as the N key. Again, if you just use my default settings, you can import all of these ahead of time. I don't think this has a default, so it's one that you'd have to set up ahead of time if you want to use it. And the next one is Hide Similar Components. There are many others, and I'll show you what these things are at a later time. But just know if you want to set up your own keystrokes, this is how you can do that. It is a really useful thing to do. I definitely recommend adjusting it. The defaults I find to be a little cumbersome to use, especially to use effectively. So for me, all of my keys have been remapped primarily to the left side of the keyboard, similar to what you might use in a computer game. You tend to use WASD on the keyboard when you're using a computer game because it keeps your elbows straight when you're using a keyboard with your left hand on the keyboard and your right hand on the mouse. It does change if you are left-handed, but you can sort of adjust that for your own preferences. But the way I have it set up for me, I can get to every single command that I want to use in SketchUp without actually having to move my hand very much at all, which just makes everything a little bit faster. So it's a good thing to get into once you start using SketchUp. So now I'm going to cover the basic tools. First is the line tool. By default, I believe it's L, but it's all the way across the keyboard, so I use F instead. And it will draw a line. You can see here, if you draw, it will automatically snap to the axes, so red, green, and blue, or will draw in any particular direction. I also have a plane here that you can see, and by default, you will start drawing on any surface that you click on. So it won't draw on a C-plane like Rhino does, unless you have nothing there. It will draw on whatever surface you click on. So if we draw lines, you can see initially the lines themselves don't do much until you enclose them and you will create a shape. So all surfaces in SketchUp will start off as planar surfaces. There is actually no such thing as a curved surface in SketchUp. It is just a series of planar faceted surfaces that make it look like it is curved. So one thing you will also notice, at least in the default styles, is that objects tend to either have one of two colors, sort of a white color or this bluish color. And this is actually a representation of the normals. So normals are something I talked about a little bit in Rhino, but essentially it's the positive side versus the negative side of a surface. So if you see here, I just rotated this guy and it has the white side now up versus the bluish side. You can change what the normal display as, or you can make it all display as white if you don't care. Normals are a good thing to be aware of though, because in general, it's always going to be something that you're going to be messing with. Especially for rendering, or if you end up doing 3D printing or other sort of advanced plugins. As soon as you do the next command, which is going to be the push-pull command, which will be this guy here, you can see it'll just start making an extrusion. It also typically will make an extrusion that is a solid, so all the normals are facing inwards. If at any time you need to flip a normal, you can just select that surface, right-click, and do reverse faces, and it will flip. If I extrude now, it still makes a solid with all the normals facing inwards. So that's what we want to see. So that next command, of course, is the push-pull. Now lines, as we just drew, can also subdivide surfaces very quickly. So we can start creating more complex shapes just by subdividing. Now a shape has to be enclosed. So if I just make a few lines here, you can see the surface itself does not become subdivided until I enclose that shape. And it can be used for subtractions as well. So we can make an opening. Now, you see here, I actually pulled my push-pull all the way through and essentially, didn't do exactly what I wanted to do. So I would have actually wanted to, when push-pulling, to make it into a hole, make sure it aligns to the bottom, and then it will open up. So again, sort of very quick modeling, and that's one of the benefits of SketchUp, is just how fast it is to make these sort of adjustments. Now again, everything I just did is relatively straight, non-curvilinear. And again, that's the strength of SketchUp. Curvilinear type modeling is not something it does particularly well. But these sort of adjustments here are all very quick. So now to cover some things about curves. So there's a circle tool up here. It's not one I use very often, but if you do use it, you can just start drawing out a circle. It gives you the center and you just draw out the radius. You could type in a number. So I could type in, say, 5, and it'll give me a radius. That was 5 inches. Typically, I tend to work in inches in SketchUp, whereas I work in feet in Rhino. Just whatever reason, that's what I've been used to. I'm going to do that again, except I'm going to make a larger circle this time so we can actually see it. So one thing you may notice about circles is we can really see the facets now. So again, each circle is made up of a series of straight lines. Under entity info, which is going to be in the default tray over here on the right, we can actually increase that. So if we wanted to make the circle look smoother, I just doubled it from 24 to 48. And you can see it's now a smoother looking circle as it becomes more subdivided. 48 to 96. And now it's even smoother still. This won't always matter. Sometimes you don't notice the facets, but it depends on your level of detail that you're aiming for. So if I extrude this guy, let's try it again. There we go. You can see it looks very smooth. And by default, it's going to smooth out the appearance of facets whenever possible when you're making extrusions like this. When you are extruding, you can, of course, type in a distance, and it will extrude exactly that distance. Down in the right-hand corner, you'll see the distances that you're working with. So if you start typing in, the same thing for a line. If you want a 5-foot long line, you can type in 5 feet, and it will make a 5-foot line, 10 feet, 5 feet. And now I have a rectangle of 5 foot by 10 foot. You can also right click if you want to get the area of that. And it should be 50 feet. So did that right. So next we'll cover offset. So offset, which I think by default is O, and it's actually the same one that I use. Since it's somewhat more infrequent, basically will allow you to make an offset on a surface or outside of it. So I can make an offset in this circle and cut that out. Again, snapping to the base so that it will make a perfect cutout for this little ring that I've made. Offset can be applied to other objects as well, so really any object can get an offset. And a kind of cool thing is when you do an offset, if you click once, it'll ask you for the dimension of that offset, in which you can put in a number, 2 inches, 5 feet, whatever it may be. Let's just say we did 1 foot. If you just double click without moving the mouse, it will automatically do the last offset that you did. So that should be another offset of 1 foot. There is a tape measure in SketchUp, but I have almost never used it, as I tend to just measure by just drawing a line, because as you draw a line, it'll give you the dimension of the line in the lower right-hand corner. So it's just kind of an unnecessary command in my opinion. All right, next. So what we've done so far is all loose surfaces and loose edges, and is generally loose geometry. This is not the way you actually want to model in SketchUp. What you want to do is take all these loose surfaces, which I just got to by double clicking until they all became selected and went blue, right click and make that into a group or component. A group is a single instance of geometry that is distinct and different from anything else it touches. So if I bring this group in contact with another bit of geometry, it doesn't latch on in any way or get attached. If I had done the same thing with ungrouped geometry, it could get attached in ways that make it hard to separate later. And this is why it's very important to always be working in groups or in components. You can make a group into a component. So I could right click and do make a component. It'll ask me to name it. It's often a good idea to name, especially if you're working in Office. I almost never do. I do usually just use the default. So I'm just going to do that here. And now I'm actually going to skip down to a later command, the move copy array. So the M command, or just hitting M, or this guy here, will allow you to move an object. While you're moving, if you hit the control key, it'll allow you to make a copy. So you can see I've made a copy of that first group, or actually I made this into a component, so my first component. If I do the same thing, I can set a specific distance. So if I want this next one to be, say, 10 feet away, maybe I'll do a bit more than that since they are larger than I expected. Let's do 25 feet. There you go. After doing a move command that had a copy involved, if you, before clicking anything else, hit the star key followed by a number, so I'm going to try 15, and you can see it's actually in the bottom right-hand corner down here. It says star 15. It might be a little small, but I promise you it's there. It should, although it didn't at that time. Let me try that one more time. Move command. I think I did too many things at once. Star 15. It will repeat that copy move command as many times as you put in. So basically it's array over 15. All spaced at the same sort of distance as an array command works. So the nice thing about components is, since we modeled these as a component, or at least we modeled them as a group and then made them into a component, if I make adjustments to one, similar to blocks in other software, I make adjustments to all of them. So you can see all of them updated. They're all now that shape. This is also a very efficient way to model for file space, as SketchUp only has to remember one of these and how many times it gets copied. So you always want to be modeling in groups. You should never have surfaces, lines, or edges that you can click on without having to double click to get into a group. That's how you end up with unusable geometry later on, as things end up just kind of getting smushed together. Now you can separate things. So if I wanted to separate this guy out, I could say, take that box, and I've selected it, and oops, try that again. Just make sure to carefully select only the edges I want and do make group. And now it should be separated. Now you can see here it didn't work perfectly because the base wasn't part of that. So I might have to go in here and edit this. You can see I also use the erase command very often to get rid of lines I don't want. That is the eraser, or E. I think that's one of the few ones I also haven't changed because it's already in a convenient position. And you can see here, anytime you have an opening, so a face missing, typically, as long as it's still planar, you can close that face in just by drawing over a line, and it'll allow it to refill in where it was. And in so doing, I've separated this out, and now I can make this guy into a block, or a group, I should say, not block. And then these guys can sit back next to each other. The nice thing now is that they are distinct and separate. So if you edit one, you're not editing the other, and you can move them around. So you never want to have loose surfaces in SketchUp. There's a lot of reasons for it. The biggest is really just that it becomes increasingly difficult to edit models that are only in loose surfaces the longer and farther that you get in your design process, as loose surfaces all tend to be attached to one another. So breaking them apart so you can edit one thing versus another becomes very challenging. So if I were drawing a wall, for example, just draw a wall. Let's make this a 10-foot wall. Wow, I didn't realize how big things were. We want it to be 6 inches wide, and I'll just make a rectangle. There is a rectangle command, but I tend to not use it. So I made a little rectangle on the ground. If I extrude this guy upwards, let's do 10 feet. And there's an extra line here. I'll get rid of that. You can see this is all separate. I want this to all be one group. The same thing occurs if I am making let's make a more complex wall. I'm not measuring this time because just being try to go a little quickly. I can also, before extruding it, make it into a group, which is another good idea. But that is the proper way to build a wall. It's the same thing for a roof or any object that exists in real life. You never want to be creating walls that are two-dimensional, such as this surface here. As only a two-dimensional surface, it actually has an infinitely thin thickness to it. It is two-dimensional, so it doesn't actually represent anything in real life accurately. So in general, you always want to avoid this. There are times where you might use this for representing a pane of glass, for example, but oftentimes I find it better to actually just model glass with a 1/4 inch of thickness, as you can see here. So one thing you'll also notice as I'm orbiting around, in Rhino, you're often using the zoom selected command to reset the center of your orbit. That is not a thing in SketchUp. You do not have to do that because SketchUp, the orbit command is much more adaptable. It's based on what you're clicking on and will make whatever you click on more or less the center of your orbit, which allows you to be much more flexible and moving around in perspective and much quicker as well. Again, I'm often switching between the sort of look around, the orbit, and the pan tool to be really effective. All right, so we covered offset, we covered groups and components, we did move and array and copy. Let's do rotate, array, and copy. So if I do the rotate command, which I confusingly have as T and not R, I have R as rectangle, but that doesn't matter too much. whatever you end up using. You can set a rotation, and your rotation will basically align to whatever surface you start clicking on. So if I'm clicking here, this surface is already aligned towards the primary axis. So I'm rotating around the blue axis if I start doing this. And you can see here I could put in a degree, so 15, or let's do something bigger. Let's do 45. A 45-degree rotation. I could also do the same thing I did with the move command, where if I put in star 15, let's try it again, rotate 45 degrees, star 15. I didn't want to do it. Okay, I just didn't like how many times I was rotating it. Oops, I created a whole bunch of stuff. Isn't that funny looking? So I had more things than one clicked at a time. So rotate, again, let's do 45 degrees and star 6. There you go. I could now do star 7 and fill out that. And you can see they're perfectly rotated around some point. So that rotate command can be pretty useful. Next is going to be basically the closest thing that SketchUp has to sort of what I'd call more abstract modeling, which is going to be the follow me tool. I'm going to draw just a surface, a vertical surface here. And that's really just so that I have a canvas to start drawing on, because I want to, let's use this drawing tool, the freehand, and just draw on this surface. Little S shape. And I'll get rid of the rest of that surface as I don't need it. I just wanted this curve. So this is often a technique that I will use, which is creating a surface as a reference surface to draw on. Because sometimes you'll need something like that. So all I really wanted to do was create a circle here, which I've done, and it's aligned, oops, it's aligned to my little curve. So the follow me tool is essentially the sweep tool. So if I click on the circle and then I just kind of drag along the curve, you can see here I can create that little S, or little pipe, basically. The follow me tool, though, can do other things. So I'm going to create another vertical surface here to draw on. And this time I'll make a kind of abstract vase type thing. Now I'm going to use the circle command on the ground. And basically I am just creating a path for this follow me tool to follow. And essentially it is a sort of, can't remember the term, a rotation around a point, because I was using a circle. And it creates a full little solid object, a little vase that way. Again, it's kind of the degrees of flexible modeling that you have with more abstract things. So you can do some interesting things with follow me. It's one of the ones to know. Again, with each one of these, I would definitely double click until it selects everything and make it into a group for both of these. Next, I'm going to cover basics of layers. So layers are now just referred to as tags in the current version of SketchUp 2020, but if you are using a previous version, they were called layers. In general, you always want your actual geometry, so not these groups themselves, but the stuff inside the groups. As soon as you can click a surface or an edge, all of that should always be on the base layer, which in SketchUp 2020 is untagged. In previous versions, it might have been layer 0. Either way, you always want everything geometry-wise to be on that layer. Additional layers, which you can name something and something 1. In this case, you might just do to organize components. So with this little shape that I made, under entity info, I can set it to be on the something layer. And the second one I will set to be on the something one layer. And basically it will turn off and on the component itself, but the geometry in the component on the inside always stays on the base layer. And that's always good modeling practices. The reason you want to make sure that you do that is, undo these things real quick. So these are both on the untagged. Let's say you have some surfaces changed to be on a different layer, but they're inside of a group. You end up turning off some of the surfaces, but not the whole thing. And it just can get really disorganized really quickly. So general rule of thumb, you always want to have all of your actual geometry on one layer and then the groups themselves on a separate layer. So that's layers. All right, so 3D warehouse. This is again one of, I think, SketchUp's most powerful assets that it has, which could be found either by Googling the SketchUp 3D warehouse or under Window 3D warehouse. There's also the extension warehouse, and actually I'll cover that real quick too. So this is how you can get a lot of different both free and paid extensions that are essentially plugins that add a lot of functionality. Cleanup 3 is one of my personal favorites. It requires this other one, TT library, which is just a bunch of stuff that's useful for this. There are many others. Everything made by this guy, TomTom, is fantastic. But there's many out here. They can be great. But we're not actually really going to cover these right now. What we are going to cover is, again, Window and 3D Warehouse. And essentially, this is just tons upon tons upon tons of 3D assets that you can bring directly into your model that can be incredibly high quality. So here we have Herman Miller furniture. All of these are made, in this case, by the company Herman Miller. So these are accurate models of their chairs, couches, furniture, whatever it may be. There's also a bunch of other companies, but you can also just search for things. So I can type in lounge chair. Should spell lounge right. And you can see here, there's a whole bunch. So I think by default right now, it gives you products. And these are actual specable pieces of furniture that you could add to your model. But you could also just go to models, and these are all random things that people have made. So anyone can submit to the 3D warehouse. So if you make a chair that you particularly like, you could put it up here. However, one word of caution, models can either be incredibly detailed to the point where a single model could be larger in size than the rest of your SketchUp model by itself, or could have random textures in it, or could be very low quality. So what I always recommend doing is whenever downloading from the SketchUp warehouse, don't download directly into your model. So if I were looking for, let's do an outdoor lounge. Say I liked, let's try this guy. You can click on it, it gives you a preview. It tells you the file size, 224 kilobyte. That's pretty small. Let's see if there's a really big one around here. You can usually tell if they look really smooth, like they have a lot of detail to them, they might end up, here's a whole bunch of outdoor furniture. So that's a good example. So if we open this, it says this one is 44 megabyte. So pretty big in file size. So you would definitely not want to bring this directly in, but if you were to download this, bring it into a separate model and copy it and paste it into your current model. So actually I might download this guy. It's going to ask you, do you want to load directly in? Again, I highly advise not doing that and opening it separately. You never know what you're going to get with these, so it's always a good idea to open it separately. So I'll just download it here, and I'll open that. So it won't open by itself if you download it separately. Sometimes I'll just have a separate SketchUp open with nothing in it that I just download files into directly with the intent of cleaning them and then bringing them into my main file. So I'm going to open that real quick. Okay, so this guy opened. And if we see here, actually already orbiting, you can see it's a little bit more laggy than the model I was working in. And there's a couple of reasons for that. There's actually some styles that are turned on, which are sort of like display modes from Rhino. They're slowing this down. They're displaying edges that are unnecessary. But also, so in a materials tab, which is going to be one of the ones that should be under your default tray. Again, if you don't have a default tray, just go here and make sure materials is turned on. I believe the B tool will actually also bring it up. There's this little house button. This shows you all the materials in this model, and you can see there is a bunch. I usually remove all of these, and unfortunately the best way to do it is just to right click and do delete and go through the process. Some of these you may end up deciding to keep, but I find especially if you end up bringing in a lot of different pieces of furniture, your own model gets clogged up with just how many different copies of materials, because every time you copy a new one in, you end up adding to the list that's already in your model. And I've worked in models in professional settings that have hundreds upon hundreds of textures, and it's impossible to work in because it's insanely slow and you can't figure out which texture you actually want to use because there's so many copies, because things have been brought in repeatedly over and over again without actual care. So in general, I always remove all the materials myself, and then if I decide to add materials to a object, I will do that myself as well, instead of just relying on the materials that exist here. So I'm not going to go through and remove all of these because there's going to take a while. But you can see here, this chair, or this couch, I should say, has had most of them removed. If I go to turn on at the very top where it says view, show hidden geometry, we can see what this couch actually looks like. We can see the cushions themselves are made up of these triangulated surfaces, and that's going to be normal for SketchUp. In general, this is pretty well made. Sometimes you'll see things that are clearly not made in SketchUp that were imported, and those often can be the worst to bring in because they tend to have the biggest file sizes. So what I'm seeing here is, a lot of sort of clean edges. They've actually done probably one of these commands up here, the round corner plugin, to soften the corners on this, which is a nice touch. May not be necessary unless you're really zooming in. But these all look like they probably originated in SketchUp, as opposed to something that might have come out of a different software. Now, modeling those cushions might be a little challenging in SketchUp, but you could probably do it. Anyways, so let's say you are happy with this couch. Again, I'm going to turn off show hidden geometry because it does tend to slow things down. This copy, I did Control-C and paste into my model. And there you go. And of course, typically these are going to come in as components. You want to make sure they are, so that if you decide to make 15 copies of it, your computer only has to remember the one. And then even though these are pretty detailed models, you're not adding to the overall file size. So next I was going to cover is scale. So this is best done on groups and components, but essentially S for scale. I believe that's the default. And you can essentially stretch things. Using the corners will keep it consistent. If you stretch on the ends, you can see here, you can make it longer or shorter. So an easy way to scale. It's also something that the default input is 1, so that would keep it at the same scale. So if you put in 2, it'll double it, 3, triple it, so on and so forth. So it's not out of 100, but it is out of 1. So if you wanted to be half, you just put in 0.5. Next I'm going to mention is the section plane. So this is going to be essentially equivalent to clipping planes in Rhino. And actually I'm going to go to my other model to do this because I think it will make more sense. So this guy here. So I have it set up as the Y command, but it doesn't come as that as default. But you can see here it starts to draw a plane where if I'm on a flat surface that's aligned to my axes, it's going to be blue. If it's not aligned to an axis, you see it goes pink. Let's find something. I don't think anything here is actually aligned to the axes I have set up. So, but basically you just click and it will place. You will likely have to move it. You see it becomes a three-dimensional physical object. And if you move it up or down, you can see what happens. One thing you will notice if you're using a version other than SketchUp 2020, you will not necessarily get poche fills like this. We can also rotate it with it selected, so, or we could have assigned it to a flat surface if we wanted. But now you can see we could get a section this way pretty quickly. Rotate it again. A little sight section going on. So that's going to be a useful command for you. I will go over the sort of viewport settings that are called styles in this case in the next video. How to make the styles that you need for this assignment, but also how to generally control them and make things look the way you want them to look. So real quickly, I'm just going to show a good example of how I made this particular thing here. So this is using several different tools. So I'm going to pull one of these guys out. Essentially, I drew out some, I believe these are 2x6s. So just draw out a rectangle. In this case, I'll do it in the other model just so I don't have to deal with any of the stuff that's here. Oh, not this one. Try that one more time. Here we go. So let's make a little tectonic construction real quickly. I'm going to draw a 2x6. So 2x6 is 5.5 inches by 1.5. Because that's the actual dimension, not the nominal dimension. So create a little rectangle on the ground here. And I can now extrude this thing up. So let's make that a 10 foot tall. So that's a 10 foot 2x6. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually just make that into a component. And I will copy it using the move command with the control key clicked to make a copy. And I'm just referencing here. I'll make a third copy. And this third one, I'm actually going to right click on and go to where it says make unique. So it's still a component, but now if I change these components, you can see the middle one isn't affected as it's now its own entity. And we'll create some kind of structure here. Bring this guy down. Oops. I moved it out of plane. So snap onto something. And let's see here. I can't remember what else I had in that particular example. Okay, how about a structure just kind of like this? And so we'll probably need some kind of support at the base. So I'm going to copy this guy again. So a lot of this sort of modeling is copying these, especially if you're keeping, say, using a 2x6 like this, making them unique so that you only affect one of them. We'll make a bench. How about that? In fact, I'm going to snap on here so I can get it to snap to level. Okay. And now we just need some kind of extra support. So I'm going to go to rotate, and I'm going to use the rotate in order to create a copy. You can see here that I'm just using the same geometry, each time making it unique. And this piece is actually going to get cut. So I'm going to double click to go into that geometry and basically use the intersection with the other piece in order to draw a line, and then use the push pull to make that piece disappear. Now, one thing you just notice is I made the rest of the model hide. And this is one of the first things I showed when I was mentioning that you can make adjustments to the keystrokes. So in this case, I have N set up to hide the rest of the model when you're editing inside of a component or group. And that's a super useful one so that you can only work on what you're working on and not see the rest. But sometimes you need to see the rest. So we'll do that. Nice little base for our bench. And then we'll take all of these things and make them into a component themselves. So we have a component living inside of a component. And now I'm going to array these. How about every, let's do every 6 feet. And then we'll do 15 of them. So you can see here, we'll make a whole wall really quickly. Now I'm going to make the structure that goes between them. So I'm going to align to center here. You can see it automatically snaps to center of things. And I'm just going to make a 5, another, I'm not going to do quite a 2x6, but I am going to do something a similar dimension. Make this, how about 0.75? So I just made a little board. Again, just going to copy it. Let's do a full 6 inches and times 4. Oops. click something wrong. All right. So a little base of our bench might be kind of high off the ground. Oh yeah, it's high off the ground. But that's okay. We can adjust it later. And now we also want to create some shade. So I'm actually going to take this same board and just bring it up. So again, using the move command until it snaps onto a surface and rotate it so that it aligns. And voila. Now again, just going to do the same movement command. Oh, looks like I did not get the rotation exactly right. Let me try that one more time. Mine actually didn't snap as where I thought it would. There we go. So when it goes pink, you can see it's using an alignment. So let's do oops, keep doing that wrong. I'm going to do this every 8 inches. So once I lay it out and give a reference point, I can just type in 8 and hit enter. And now that's spaced. Oh, I forgot. So these, I didn't make these into a component. So I'm going to make this one into a component at least. These down here are actually just groups, and that'll be okay. My mistake, but should have done it better. So 8 inches, and then we'll do times 15. See a few extra there, so I could hit times 10. Nope, too late. If you do another command, it goes away. All right, so that's what I wanted. And now I will select all of those, unselecting the frames that I started with, make that into a component. And then I will array this every 6 feet times 15. So again, the benefit here is because I've been working diligently with components, if I make changes to one of these, so if I make changes to this one frame, say I wanted to make that longer, you can see it affects all of them. If I decide that I want to, let's see, erase every other one of these, it erases every other one of them along the entire row. And of course, they don't have to be in a row. So I could, let's just delete all of these and that. So we'll do a 60-degree rotation times 8. There we go. And look at that. Starting to create a little radial structure. And again, so if I come back in, I not only can edit, but I could also continue adding more detail. So if I wanted to make it back to this thing, I could do that. Oops. Got to get these rotations to go right. And pull that up. And this will be the last thing, well, one of the last things I do. 8 inches again, times 10. And now they all have it. So again, that's the power of components, to be able to make one thing and make a lot of changes to a lot of things. All right. So next thing, I'm just going to go back to this other model real quick. And just, again, I talked about how you would want to make walls and things as their own separate objects. But just to give an example here, so this roof is a separate object from these columns. These columns and the roof are both a separate object from the wall that's here. And then this sort of frame of glazing that we see here was simply done by creating, subdividing the surface. So now I would normally use actual measurements here, but basically using subdivision here can start, say, make 2 inches in. And pretty quickly I have a window frame of some sort that then I could come back with a rectangle tool and create a nice pane of glass, put it somewhere. Now I actually didn't want to do that just yet because I wanted to make sure everything here was in a group before I make my pane of glass. Because you can see there the pane of glass started moving as I tried to move it. It tried to move the frame itself. And I'll just move this in, make that 1/4 inch thick, make that into a group. And looks like the backside of this didn't end up with a surface on it, but I can just, hopefully I can complete it. Sometimes SketchUp can be a little finicky about completing surfaces. Oh, it's because no, I'm in the group. Sometimes you just have to go around and figure out where the piece is missing, and there was nothing missing. Okay, so again, that's how you could do that. Whenever I'm adding new textures, I always tend to start by using the colors. That's just going to be under the color palette here. There are other things in here. They tend to not look great, so if you're going to use your own textures, use your own textures. I'm just going to make my glass out of this gray here. And I will orbit around to make sure, even look on the inside, make sure it's painted on all sides. And then edit this and make the transparency lower. So now I have a nice pane of glass that fits in the center here. Can copy it over. And voila, that's how I made those sort of doors. So the stairs that I have here, simply just taking this, so my whole base surface here is one surface, and this is the same base that I will have given you guys, where I just started making manipulations. So pull that out. Stairs are 711, so just divide that up. So if I wanted to, I need to turn off my sections actually real quick, because they are not helpful to me right now. But let's say that I've already subdivided this base, but say I wanted to do even more terracing going on. So you can see here it goes from a high point up here and sort of steps down. I could, let's just find the middle here. I could drag all the way across. You can see it will go green and follow along the axes of the world axes, or the group axes in this case. Usually you can actually use a reference like pink line, there it is, and follow another angle. So I could then lower this 6 inches and make a whole bunch of stepping that happens. I could create a pool in the center here, doing an offset, and then maybe come in and move an individual line. I'm gonna use this edge here to sort of move along that edge. And now I could just do a push pull, make a little pool. So again, part of SketchUp's advantage is its speed and flexibility of being able to make these moves. You don't have to make an object to make a Boolean to make a cut into something. You can just start drawing on it and make those cuts quickly and easily. So the other command, so I showed you what happens when you turn on what I have set as N, which is the hide the rest of component. The other, which I have set as V, which is also, neither of these have a default, so they have to be keystrokes you set up, or be use the settings that I distribute, which I have as V, will hide the rest of the copies of that component. So if there's more than one of a component, it'll hide the rest of it. But basically I alternate between these two often when editing inside of components and inside of groups. All right. So again, don't have to worry too much about this. Ideally, use this as a way to iterate on your studio model. If you are one of the people who are just taking skills at this point, just make a sort of simple massing on the site that we provided, and just create something. Just have fun with it and try to use the tools that we've covered. In either case, you won't be judged on your design for this assignment. Mostly, we're just looking to see that you try out the tools and do experimentation. So try things out. Ideally, use this again as a sort of exploration tool for Studio. It's another way to sort of look at the designs you're already looking at anyway, so use that to your advantage. I will cover texturing and some other things in the next video, as well as getting the output from SketchUp and bringing it into Photoshop and the basic things that I did for my little Photoshop render. Okay, that's going to be it for this one. Thanks.